Johnny Tremain, Chapter 10, Part 4. There are 3 questions I would like to ask before we begin. 8th grade. Number 1. What warning does Boston send to Charlestown? 2. How does Paul Revere get to his horse for the famous ride? And number 3. Through which 2 historical events does Johnny sleep? Part 4. "It's tonight, all right," Johnny said to Dr. Warren, "and Colonel Smith will command." He went on to tell what he had found out from Dove, that the expedition would start tonight, and that Lexington and Concord were the likely objects. The men sitting about in Warren's surgery had already guessed. But they were interested to learn that the colonel, and presumably his troops, expected to return to Boston the day after they set out, and that he was to command them. Seemingly Gage, a punctilious man, had chosen Francis Smith because he had been in service longer than any of the other, and smarter, colonels. Hark! Outside the close window, on Tremont Street, a small group of soldiers were marching stealthily toward the common. These were the first they heard. But soon another group marched past, then another. A man whose duty it was to watch the British boats at the foot of the common came in to say he had actually seen the men getting into the boats heading for Cambridge. Dr. Warren turned to Johnny. "Run to Ann Street. Bid Billy Dawes come to me here, ready to ride. Then go to North Square. I've got to talk to Paul Revere before he starts. Both he and Dawes will be expecting a messenger." Billy Dawes was in his kitchen. He was a homely, lanky, young fellow with close-set eyes and a wide, expressive mouth. He and his wife had dressed him for the part he would play, a drunken farmer. His wife, who looked more like a schoolgirl than a serious matron, could not look at him without going from one giggling fit to another. She laughed even more, and Billy joined her, when Johnny came in and said the time had come. The young man stuck a dilapidated hat with a broken feather on his head, and his wife picked up a bottle of rum and poured it over the front of his torn jacket. Then she kissed him, and they both laughed. As he stood before them, his expression changed. His eyes went out of focus. His grin became foolish. He hiccuped and swayed. He both looked and smelled like a drunken farmer. But he did have money in his pocket, which no country blade would have had after a big toot in town. He knew one of the soldiers guarding the neck that night. He believed he'd get out all right. The scene in the Dawes kitchen was so light-hearted and so comical, and Johnny, as well as little Mrs. Dawes, laughed so hard he wondered if he had any idea of the risk her husband was running. For by any law of any land, a man caught exciting to armed rebellion might be shot. The second the door closed after the young man, Johnny knew. Mrs. Dawes stood where her husband had left her, all laughter wiped from her face. Billy Dawes was not the only gifted actor in his family. From Ann Street, Johnny ran toward North Square. This he found crowded with light infantry and grenadier companies, all in full battle dress. They got in his way, and he in theirs. One of the men swore and struck at him with his gun butt. The regulars were getting ugly. He could not get to the Revere's front door, but by climbing a few fences, he reached their kitchen door and knocked softly. Paul Revere was instantly outside in the dark with him. Johnny, he whispered, the Somerset has been moved into the mouth of the Charles. Will you run to Copp's Hill and tell me if they have moved in any of the other warships? I think I can row around one, but 3 or 4 might make me trouble. I'll go look. Wait. Then go to Robert Newman. You know, the Christ Church sexton. He lives with his mother opposite the church. I know. They have British officers billeted on them. Don't rap at that door. Take this stick. Walk by the house slowly, limping, tapping with the stick until the light in an upper window goes out. Then go round to the alley behind the house. Tell Newman the lanterns are to be hung now. 2 of them. He knows what to do. As Johnny stood among the graves of lonely Copp's Hill, looking across the broad mouth of the Charles, he could see lights in the houses of Charlestown. And over there he knew men were watching Boston, watching Christ's lofty spire, waiting for the signal. And as soon as they saw it, the best and fastest horse in Charlestown would be saddled and made ready for Paul Revere, who had himself promised to get over, if possible. Ride and spread the alarm. Summon the Minutemen. He watched the riding lights on the powerful 64-gun Somerset. The British had evidently thought her sufficient to prevent boats crossing the river that night. She was alone. The moon had risen. The tide was rising. The Somerset was winding at her anchor. The night was unearthly sweet. It smelled of land and of the sea, but most of all, it smelled of spring. Salem Street, where the Newmans lived, like North Square, was filled with soldiers. The redcoats were assembling here, getting ready to march down to the Common, and they would be a little late. Their orders were to be ready by moonrise. A sergeant yelled at Johnny as he started to limp past them, but when he explained in a piteous whine that his foot had been squashed by a blow from a soldier's musket, and all he wanted was to get home to his mamma, an officer said the men were to let the child pass. Johnny was 16, but he could pull himself together and play at being a little boy still. Downstairs, in the Newman house, he could look in and see a group of officers as usual, almost as always, playing at cards. Their jackets were unbuttoned, their faces flushed. They were laughing and drinking. There was on the second floor one light. Johnny couldn't believe anyone up there could hear him tapping in the street below. Instantly, the light went out. He had been heard. Newman, a sad-faced young man, got out a second-story window in back and ran across a shed roof and was in the alley waiting for Johnny. 1 or 2, he whispered. 2. That was all. Robert Newman seemed to melt away in the dark. Johnny guessed what the little tinkle was he heard. Newman had the keys to Christ's Church in his hand. The 2 friends, Paul Revere and Joseph Warren, were standing in the doctor's surgery. They were alone. Revere was urging Warren to cross with him that very night to Charlestown. If there was fighting tomorrow, Gage would not hesitate to hang him, at last, for high treason. But Warren said no. He would stay and keep track of the British plans until the very last moment. The second a shot has been fired, I'll send a messenger to you, Revere promised. I'll wait until then. Why, Revere, I never saw you worry about anything before. I'll be a lot safer tonight than you'll be, catching crabs out on that river, being shot at by the Somerset, and falling off horses. I'll not forget you and Parson Tumley's ambling jade. He was always ragging Revere about falling off horses. It was some old joke between them which Johnny did not know, and both the men suddenly began to laugh. The mood between them had been heavy when Johnny came in, but now it lightened. They parted as casually as any friends who believe they will meet in a few days. But each knew the other was in deadly peril of his life. It was 10 o'clock. Dr. Warren told his colored man to make up a bed for Johnny in the surgery. The boy could not think of bed. He stole down to the common to see the secret embarkation. It was almost over, and was no secret. Hundreds of townsfolk stood about silently, watching the boats returning from Cambridge shore and taking on yet another scarlet-coated cargo. But where these men were heading and who commanded them, scarce a man in the crowd knew except Johnny. Farther down the river, he knew the Somerset was on guard. By now, Paul Revere was in his boat, trying to steal around her. In Charlestown, the horse waited for him. He saw Sandy step into a boat with never a quiver. He recognized Lieutenant Stranger's own horse, and for a moment saw the young man's dark face in the moonlight. Being a horse-minded boy, he noticed that there was a little trouble with a showy white horse built like Sandy, but much younger. This was Major Pitcairn's. Were the Marines being sent as well as the Grenadiers and light infantry companies? Or was the rough, genial, stout-hearted old major merely going along for the fun of it? At least, he thought this observation important enough to report to Warren. Other spies had been bringing news of the embarkation. It had been noticed that Pitcairn was not in his usual tavern. He had been seen with a civilian cape wrapped about him, heading for the common. Doubtless he was going. Gage had sent him either because he knew he was a better officer than Colonel Smith, or because he had a way with Yankees. Everyone liked the pious, hard-swearing, good-tempered Major Pitcairn. A barmaid from Hull Street came in to say she had been watching the Somerset at just the time Bentley and Richardson were rowing Paul Revere to Charlestown. Not a shot had been fired. It was also known that Billy Dawes had woven and bribed his inebriated way past the guards on the neck, and the horse he was leading and pretending to try to sell had not looked like much, a thin bony beast in a bridle patched with rope. It was one of the fastest horses in Boston. Then Dr. Warren told Johnny to lie down and get some sleep. It was almost midnight. Johnny took off his jacket and boots, rolled up in a blanket on the bed the black man had made for him. The night before and the night before that he had been much upset over Rab's leaving. His thoughts had turned to the empty bed beside him. He had slept badly, although people were still about the surgery, exchanging ideas, trying to guess what the future might be. He immediately fell asleep. It was dawn. He was alone in the surgery and still sleeping. But out in Lexington, on the village green, the first shot was fired. One shot, and then a volley. And Major Pitcairn was saying, "Disperse, ye rebels, ye villains, disperse! Why don't ye lay down your arms?" The war had begun. It was the dawn, of the 19th of April. But Johnny Tremain still slept.